Have you heard the rumors? Because if you spend literally any time online or, listen to interviews with certain high-profile celebrities, you probably stumbled across these wild, almost unbelievable stories.
Oh, absolutely. They're everywhere right now.
Right. People are describing these moments where they encounter the divine or process decades of severe trauma in like 20 minutes, or suddenly cure their lifelong paralyzing depression.
Yeah, and the catalyst for all of this is what really catches people off guard.
Exactly. The catalyst is interacting with the defensive secretion of a specific desert toad.
Mm.
And, I mean, for most of us, this sounds like an urban legend. It feels like one of those fringe internet trends that you just scroll right past because it seems completely divorced from actual science.
It carries that distinct aura of a modern myth, The idea of extracting a miracle cure from a desert amphibian sounds like something out of a fantasy novel.
Totally.
It just seems completely detached from the sterile, rigorous world of formal medicine.
But here is the reality check that forces us to stop scrolling. While it sounds like a bizarre internet rumor, this exact substance is currently triggering one of the most serious, rapid, and paradigm-shifting movements in modern psychiatry.
It really is.
We are looking at a potential revolution in how the medical field treats the human mind.
Which is really the core of our exploration today. We're pulling apart a fascinating breakdown published in Psychology Today by Dr. Mark S. Gold.
Right. Great article.
He meticulously documents how a substance that began as this, underground, highly dangerous biological phenomenon is now sitting right at the center of multi-million-dollar pharmaceutical research.
So our mission for this deep dive is to trace that unbelievable journey. We're going to follow a molecule known as 5-MeO DMT all the way from its origins in the dirt of the American Southwest, through the microphones of massive celebrity podcasts, and finally into the highly sterile, strictly controlled labs of FDA clinical trials.
Yeah, it's quite the pipeline.
It's insane. We are talking about a drug derived from a literal toad that might fundamentally change how we approach treatment-resistant depression.
The contrast is staggering, but it is deeply grounded in life-saving potential. At the center of all the cultural hype is a biological mechanism that's basically forcing neuroscientists to completely rethink how the brain recovers from severe psychiatric conditions.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand how a toad's defense mechanism actually landed in elite pharmaceutical trials, we first have to look at how it completely bypassed the normal scientific system.
Right, the traditional pipeline.
Exactly. Usually, a new psychiatric treatment goes from a scientist's bench to a patient's bedside in a very orderly, highly regulated, decades-long pipeline. But this compound took a massive, chaotic detour through a pop culture explosion.
It flipped the traditional script entirely. But before we map out that cultural explosion, we really need to establish the biology here.
Good idea.
So the biological source of this phenomenon is the Sonoran Desert toad. The scientific name is Encilius alvarius, though it used to be classified as Bufo alvarius.
I've heard the term Bufo thrown around a lot.
Yeah, that's where it comes from. And we need to be clear about the scale here. This is not some tiny, delicate tree frog. This is a massive olive green amphibian that grows up to 8 inches long.
Wow.
And it's native to the harsh environments of the American Southwest and northern Mexico.
An 8-inch toad is substantial. And this specific animal produces a highly unique defensive secretion rate. Like when the toad is threatened by a predator, the glands on its skin exude this milky substance.
Right.
And locked inside that substance is 5-MeO DMT.
Exactly. Pharmacologically, 5-MeO DMT is categorized as an ultra-short-acting serotonergic psychedelic.
Okay, break that down for us.
Well, to put that in perspective, traditional daily antidepressants like your standard SSRIs, they also target the serotonin system in your brain. But they do it by creating a slow, steady trickle of chemicals over weeks or even months.
Right.
A serotonergic psychedelic like 5-MeO DMT targets those exact same serotonin receptors but triggers an immediate, overwhelming neurological cascade. It is incredibly potent. And on top of that, the DEA classifies it as a Schedule I-controlled substance.
And just to clarify for you, the listener, a Schedule I classification is the most restrictive category in the United States. It legally dictates that a drug has a high potential for abuse and absolutely no currently accepted medical use.
Which is a huge barrier.
Huge. That classification usually creates an impenetrable wall of red tape that makes clinical research incredibly difficult, not to mention expensive.
Which makes its current status in clinical trials even more remarkable, honestly. The scientific community generally stays far, far away from Schedule I substances that lack a clear, established medical pedigree.
So we have this highly restricted, heavily criminalized substance locked inside the defense mechanism of a desert amphibian. How does something like that jump into the mainstream consciousness?
Yeah, it's a great question.
The tipping point seems to be what you could call the Mike Tyson effect. Between 2019 and 2021, the former world heavyweight champion boxer went incredibly public with his experiences.
He really did.
He described taking this toad medicine as a profound, life-altering event. He explicitly credited the substance for massive, immediate improvements in his depression, his psychological trauma, and his struggles with substance addiction.
He was definitely the loudest voice, but certainly not the only one. Other prominent figures across athletics, music, and entertainment began echoing these exact same narratives.
It's like a domino effect.
Yeah. And they took these stories to massive media platforms, most notably Joe Rogan's podcast, which, reaches tens of millions of listeners.
Right.
Suddenly, you had detailed, serious features being published in the New York Times and GQ magazine discussing the therapeutic potential of toad secretions.
It was a total media blitz. It functioned almost like a viral TikTok trend. But instead of teenagers promoting a dance craze, you had influential adults promoting a profound, paradigm-shifting psychological intervention.
What's fascinating here is how the underground community actually framed the substance to the public. If you look at the language that emerged during this media boom,
Like the slang terms.
yeah, terms like toad medicine, Bufo, and most famously, the God molecule, this nomenclature wasn't accidental at all.
Oh, really?
No, it was a deliberate cultural reframing. The underground community intentionally wrapped this biological defensive secretion in spiritual, almost mythological narratives.
I see.
They wanted to emphasize a transcendent, mystical experience rather than its literal pharmacological identity as 5-MeO DMT.
And part of that spiritual framing involved attaching this deep, ancient history to the practice, didn't it? Because you started seeing claims across the internet that inhaling toad venom was this ancient religious sacrament, like something indigenous cultures have been doing for thousands of years.
That narrative is incredibly pervasive, and it's actually a major historical myth.
Wait, really? It's entirely made up.
Pretty much. Despite all the romantic claims of ancient religious origins, anthropologists and historians have found absolutely no credible evidence for the historical use of Sonoran Desert toad secretions.
Wow.
The modern practice actually traces back only to the late 20th century. In the 1980s, this obscure pamphlet began circulating that detailed how to extract and smoke the substance.
Just a random pamphlet.
Yeah. And that information slowly disseminated through underground psychedelic communities before being adopted and essentially repackaged into these modern neo-shamanic practices.
Okay, I have to push back on this sequence of events because the timeline is a massive contradiction.
How so?
You're telling me we have a heavily restricted Schedule I drug, which legally means it has no medical value. It's surrounded by completely fabricated ancient mythology, and it's being promoted by celebrity podcasters and athletes. Usually, serious neuroscientists and clinical researchers run in the opposite direction of that kind of media circus. How did a viral fad effectively force the mainstream medical community to pay attention?
Well, the psychiatric community didn't want to look at it, but they were essentially backed into a corner by the sheer weight of the clinical claims.
Because they needed new treatments.
Exactly. The field of psychiatry is currently desperate for better tools. Treatment-resistant depression is a massive global burden. Conventional antidepressants can take weeks or months to show any effect, and for about 30% of patients, they simply never work.
That's a huge portion of people.
And the side effects can be debilitating. So when you have widespread, undeniable anecdotal reports of people achieving immediate, lasting remission from severe trauma and depression after a single exposure to a compound, researchers are practically obligated by their Hippocratic oath to look under the hood.
But looking under the hood brought its own set of immediate real-world disasters. Because the media hype worked. Suddenly, everyone looking for relief wanted to try the toad.
Yeah, the demand skyrocketed.
This media-driven demand created an absolute explosion of informal, unregulated toad ceremonies. Vulnerable people were flocking to the desert or paying exorbitant fees for these underground retreats. And that sudden popularity had immediate, highly dangerous consequences.
The fallout was really twofold. First, there was a devastating ecological toll. The massive surge in demand led to severe, rapid overhunting.
People were just catching them in the wild.
Yes, poachers and opportunistic guides were pulling the Sonoran Desert toad out of its natural habitat at an alarming rate. The population began to decline so sharply that it raised major sustainability and animal welfare crises.
The ecological impact got so bad that the National Park Service actually had to step in. They literally issued public warnings telling humans to stop licking, harassing, or stealing the toads.
This sounds absurd, but it's true.
A federal agency had to actively tell the public to leave a specific amphibian alone because the wellness trend had become that destructive.
The desperation of the users was destroying the ecosystem. But beyond the ecological harm, the physical risks to the users themselves were immense. The natural secretion of this toad is not just a pure, clean, psychedelic molecule.
Right, because it's a defense mechanism. It's designed to punish predators who try to eat the toad.
Precisely. The raw secretion contains a complex cocktail of biological compounds, most notably a group of substances called Bufo toxins. And Bufo toxins are potentially cardiotoxic.
Meaning they damage the heart.
Yes. They can cause direct, severe damage to the heart muscle. They can induce dangerous cardiac arrhythmias.
So people seeking mental health treatment are going to these informal retreats and taking a completely unmeasured dose of a raw biological substance that could literally stop their heart.
And add to that the psychological danger. Because this was happening in unsupervised, underground settings without trained psychiatric support, there were widespread reports of intense psychological distress.
Like bad trips.
Worse. Patients experienced severe panic attacks, long-term paranoia, deep emotional destabilization, and physical injury simply because they were losing total control of their motor functions in unsafe environments.
So we are stuck in a massive paradox. To frame it differently, relying on the live toad for therapeutic benefits is like trying to get your daily required vitamins by eating an entire, unpeeled, potentially poisonous wild plant instead of just taking a refined lab-made supplement.
That's a great way to put it.
You technically might get the vitamin, but you're also ingesting a bunch of toxins that could make you violently ill. You can't just eat the wild plant. You need a laboratory to extract the good stuff.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is exactly that variability that makes the natural route a massive medical liability. In an uncontrolled setting, the sheer variability in dosing, you have no idea how much actual 5-MeO DMT or Bufo toxin is in a specific scrape of venom combined with the absence of structured psychiatric support, turns a potential medicine into a dangerous gamble.
Which forces the psychiatric community into a specific direction. If the raw natural secretion is too inherently dangerous for human hearts and the demand is ecologically decimating the toad species, how do we ethically harness this therapeutic power for the listener? They had to figure out a way to move the focus entirely from the desert into the laboratory.
They realized they had to separate the therapeutic molecule from the animal. They needed a pure synthetic version of 5-MeO DMT.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because you would naturally assume that synthesizing this complex, mysterious God molecule would require some massive, cutting-edge 21st century scientific breakthrough, but it wasn't a modern breakthrough at all.
No, not even close. The chemistry had been solved decades ago. Synthetic 5-MeO DMT was actually first synthesized in a laboratory way back in 1936.
1936, that is before the Second World War.
It was synthesized by two pioneering Japanese chemists, Hoshino and Shimodera. They successfully mapped and recreated the molecule purely out of scientific curiosity.
That timeline is just a massive contradiction. You have two chemists synthesizing the exact molecule in 1936, but it basically sits on a shelf collecting dust. It is completely ignored by modern psychiatric science, and it takes almost a century and a heavyweight boxer talking on a podcast for the medical community to finally investigate the tool they had been ignoring all along.
It perfectly illustrates how chemical discoveries often lack clinical application until a specific cultural or medical need aligns with them. The molecule existed, but the framework to understand its psychiatric value didn't.
That makes sense.
But now that the connection has been forged, researchers are exclusively utilizing highly purified, standardized intranasal and vaporized preparations of 5-MeO DMT. By moving to synthetic manufacturing, they completely eliminate the toad, they remove the cardiotoxic Bufo toxins, and they erase the ecological impact.
So we have the clean, safe, lab-made version, but we need to explain the biology of the cure itself. How does a single, intense psychedelic experience actually cure something as deeply rooted and biologically stubborn as severe depression?
This raises an important question about the mechanism of action because it completely defies our traditional understanding of psychiatry. A recent, massive neuroimaging mega-analysis was published in the highly respected journal Nature Medicine by researcher Manesh Gurn and his colleagues.
What did they look at?
They looked closely at how psychedelics alter brain architecture. 5-MeO DMT operates through an entirely different therapeutic mechanism than conventional antidepressants.
If it's not acting like a traditional SSRI, which just tweaks daily chemical levels, they must be looking at actual structural changes in the brain, how the neurons are physically communicating with one another.
That is exactly what they found. They discovered that psychedelics display a consistent network fingerprint.
A network fingerprint.
Yes. To understand this, we have to look at something called the default mode network, or the DMN. The DMN is essentially the brain's ego center. It is the network responsible for your internal monologue, your rigid self-reflection, and how you perceive your past and future.
And in a depressed patient, that default mode network becomes hyperactive. It locks the person into a rigid negative feedback loop where they just ruminate on their trauma and sadness endlessly.
Exactly. The DMN becomes overbearing. What 5-MeO DMT seems to do is act like a massive temporary reboot of that specific network.
It just shuts it off.
It takes the DMN offline, which suddenly allows other parts of the brain regions that normally never talk to each other to start communicating freely. It physically reconfigures large-scale brain circuit connectivity. It's essentially rewiring the brain's baseline rather than just tweaking daily chemicals.
Let's visualize that. Think of depressed brain like a ski slope. Over years of negative thinking and trauma, the skis carve deep, rigid grooves into the snow. Every single time you try to think differently or try to feel better, your mind just slides right back into those same dark, entrenched tracks. You can't steer out of them.
That's a great analogy.
What 5-MeO DMT does is drop a massive, fresh layer of snow over the entire mountain. It fills in the grooves, flattens the landscape, and allows the brain to ski freely in entirely new, healthier directions.
That is a perfect illustration of neuroplasticity. It rewires the baseline. And because of the sheer power of that potential reset, we are now witnessing an intense, highly funded race within the pharmaceutical industry. Companies are scrambling to turn the synthetic compound into a legally prescribed in-clinic treatment.
And the defining feature of this race, the specific detail that makes 5-MeO DMT so uniquely attractive to pharmaceutical companies compared to other psychedelics like, say, psilocybin or LSD, is the unprecedented speed of the drug.
The timeline is truly astonishing for psychiatric care. Depending on the route of administration, the drug hits fast and clears out even faster. If the synthetic compound is vaporized and inhaled, the psychological effects begin in under 30 seconds.
Under 30 seconds, from administration to peak effect.
Yes, and the entire experience is completely over within 20 minutes. If the clinical trial utilizes an intranasal spray or an intramuscular injection, the onset takes slightly longer, about 3 to 5 minutes, and the whole session fully subsides within 45 to 60 minutes.
If the timeline is that fast, the logistics of psychiatric care completely change. Pharmaceutical companies must be taking different approaches to figure out the best way to administer this.
They are, and currently there are 2 leading pharmaceutical programs advancing toward Phase 3 trials.
Phase 3 being the final big hurdle before FDA approval, right?
Exactly. The first major player is a partnership between Atai Life Sciences and Beckley Psytech. They are developing a drug called BPL-003. Their program uses an intranasal fixed-dose approach.
So we're talking about a standardized nasal spray, a fixed dose meaning one specific measurement that applies to everyone, making it incredibly predictable for a doctor to prescribe.
Right. Their focus is on extreme standardization. But the second leading program, run by GH Research with a formulation called GH001, is taking a completely different angle. They're using an inhaled method, but their strategy relies on intrasession dose escalation.
Intrasession dose escalation, meaning instead of a one-size-fits-all dose, the doctor starts the patient on a very low dose and steps it up incrementally during the exact same appointment.
Exactly. They administer increasing amounts during a single visit until that specific patient hits a full psychedelic effect. Their priority is maximizing efficacy in one single day.
And the results from these mid-stage trials, are they actually proving the claims that the underground users were making years ago?
The clinical data is incredibly robust. The trials are showing rapid, clinically meaningful reductions in depressive symptoms. The most staggering data point is that significant portions of patients are achieving full remission in a matter of days.
Days instead of weeks.
Yes, compared to weeks or even months of trial and error for normal antidepressants.
So what does this all mean? If we think about how you, the listener, or someone you deeply care about might currently treat depression. The standard model of taking daily pills is a grueling process. It's like taking a cross-country train. It takes a really long time to get where you want to go. You feel every bump along the way.
Right, the side effects can be awful.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This new 5-MeO DMT treatment, on the other hand, is like boarding a supersonic jet. The launch is incredibly intense. It's an overwhelming experience. But you arrive at your destination, a rewired, functional brain, almost immediately.
And from a healthcare logistics standpoint, that speed is revolutionary. Let's look at other psychedelic-assisted therapies currently making headlines, like MDMA for PTSD or psilocybin for depression.
Right, those take all day.
Exactly. Those therapies require highly expensive, multi-hour prolonged sessions. You need 2 trained therapists in a room with a single patient for 6 to 8 hours. It's notoriously difficult to scale.
Most people simply can't afford to take a day off work for an 8-hour specialized therapy session.
But a 5-MeO DMT intervention solves that bottleneck. It can be completed from start to finish in under an hour. It is a highly scalable, practical outpatient protocol.
And the research isn't just stopping at treatment-resistant depression either. The source material points out that the medical ambitions for this molecule are expanding rapidly.
Yes, ongoing studies are currently testing this synthetic compound for a wide range of conditions. They are looking at major depressive disorder, postpartum depression, severe PTSD, and even alcohol use disorder.
It's truly a remarkable trajectory. To quickly recap what we've unpacked today, we started with a raw, defensive biological secretion from an 8-inch desert toad, a substance that was wrapped in fake ancient mythology, hyped up by celebrities and podcasters, and utilized in dangerous, unregulated underground retreats that severely harmed the environment.
And out of that dangerous cultural chaos, the scientific community managed to extract the core therapeutic mechanism. They took a synthetic molecule first created in 1936, stripped away the dangers, and developed an ultra-short-acting pharmaceutical that reorganizes the brain's circuitry in a matter of minutes.
Connect this back to your own life. Whether you struggle with mental health yourself or know someone who does, this deep dive shows that the future of psychiatry might look entirely different very soon. We could be shifting away from daily, slow-acting medications toward single, rapid, in-clinic interventions that actually respect your time and your biology.
It really represents a profound shift in medicine.
But before we wrap up, there is one final, incredibly provocative detail tucked into Dr. Gold's article that we need to leave you with. Right now, researchers are investigating whether a full mystical experience is actually biologically necessary for the drug to be effective.
It's a huge debate right now. Can you get the cure without the journey?
And I want you to mull this over on your own. If science eventually manages to completely isolate this healing mechanism so that a patient gets the structural brain reboot without ever feeling the psychedelic trip at all, does the treatment lose a fundamental, deeply human element of the healing process? Or does stripping away the unpredictable journey simply make it the perfect, flawless medicine?